During the 90s, the Leaning Tower of Pisa began to lean too far. Seeing that the 180-foot high tower would soon become dangerous if left to its own, engineers designed a system to salvage the 12th century landmark by stabilizing the tower at a consistent lean. First, the engineers injected super cold liquid into nitrogen into the ground to freeze it, and thereby minimize the dangerous ground vibrations that would occur during the work that followed. Then they planned to install an underground system of cables to pull the structure more upright. Engineers hoped that the underground cable network would pull the tower at least an inch away from the dangerous lean. Left to itself, our world is similar to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, tilting and heading to catastrophe. To prevent total anarchy, God has established governments to maintain order. Governments and their laws function like the steel cables that hold the Leaning Tower in place. The tower still leans, it's not perfect, and neither are our governments, but the cables, like the laws, prevent from catastrophe, in the government's case, from total anarchy. Today, we are going to take a look at a passage in which the Apostle Paul discusses our obligations to the government, including whether we should pay taxes or not. We will be taking a look at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. In verses 1 and 2, we will see that Christians are to obey the laws of our government because it has been appointed by God to carry out its rule. In verses 3 and 4, we will see that Christians should obey their government because the government is God's servant, which is an odd way to think of our government. And in verses 5 through 7, we will see that we are to obey our government because their laws are an expression of God's will for our lives. Let's take a look at the passage. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. All right, so let's take a look at verses 1 and 2. Here we're going to see that Christians are commanded to obey their government as God's appointed. Now, just a review of where we have been and where we are. After looking at the various facets of the gospel in chapters 1 through 11, Paul then turned to more practical applications in chapters 12 through 15, and all of these practical applications flow out of what he's been teaching about the gospel in chapters 1 and 11. In chapter 12, we saw that we should apply God's word to our lives because of his great mercy toward us. That should be our motivation. Now, and then we saw how we are to live together as believers, like brothers and sisters in Christ, using our gifts, our spiritual gifts, to benefit each other. We saw that we should have genuine love for each other and serve God enthusiastically. We saw how we should live with non-believers, sacrificing our time and our money to help them achieve good in their lives, including their salvation. And in these 7 verses, at the beginning of chapter 13, we saw how we are to relate to our government. So let's take a look at verse 1. Verse 1 reads, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now let's take a closer look at that first phrase. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Notice first that it says every person. That means there are no exceptions. No one can say, well, I'm not going to obey the government because God didn't tell me I had to. He did tell us. He told us that every person should obey the government. Now, the word to be subject is a word in the Greek that means a voluntary submission, not an involuntary. Not that the government forces you to submit, but that you choose to submit. Christians should voluntarily submit to the laws of the government. Non-Christians may rebel against government laws, and they may pay the price. They may pay a fine. They may be imprisoned if they violate the law. But Christians should voluntarily submit to the government. Now, the word that is translated governing authorities comes from a root word which means superior. But here it doesn't mean physically or emotionally or even morally superior. It just means that they have a superior authority. They are over us in terms of their authority. In our government, rulers have authority because people elect them. They are granted authority by those who elect them to office. So we can see that we are to voluntarily submit to those who have authority over us. But why? Why does God put governments over us so that we then have to submit to them? We see the answer in the next two phrases. So let's take a look at the next phrase of verse 1. The next phrase is, "For there is no authority except from God." God's authority is absolute. He is sovereign over all things, but he gives those who are in government their authority. Now, we often think that when enough of us vote for a particular candidate, we are the ones who give them their authority. But that's not what Paul says. Paul says that all authority is given by God to people who are in authority. Whether we approve of our leaders or not, the reason that they are in their position is due to God's sovereign choice, not ours. Sometimes God blesses us with good leaders, and sometimes he puts bad leaders over us so that we can, as a trial or as a punishment for wrongs that have been done. But whether he has given us good or bad leaders, we are supposed to submit to our leaders because God has put them in that position of authority over us. That is why that is exactly what the next phrase tells us. And those that exist have been instituted by God. We may not like the rulers over us. We might not like the way that they are ruling, but we are to look upon them as God's instituted rulers and give them honor and obedience and even taxes, as we will see in 6 and 7, verses 6 and 7. Since we are to be subject to the governing authorities that God has instituted, Paul then draws a spiritual application in the next verse. So let's take a look at verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Let's take a look at that first phrase. The ESV writes, therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed. But you could actually translate it literally as, whoever resists the authority has taken a stand against God's command. In other words, resisting the authorities, according to Paul, means taking a stand against God's revealed will. It means taking a stand against God himself. So when we violate the laws of our country, we are violating God's will. This is a general principle. God reveals his will through the authorities that he has instituted above us. But you may be asking yourself, aren't there any exceptions to this? I mean, what about Nazi Germany? Should I just do what they say? I mean, many people did, and some of them paid a price for that. There are exceptions to this general rule. And we see one of the exceptions illustrated in Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 5, the church in Jerusalem is growing, and the growth has infuriated Jewish leaders. So they arrest all of the apostles and put them in jail. However, in the night, an angel appears to them and releases them from prison with the command to go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of life. So early the next morning, the apostles entered the temple precincts and began to preach the gospel of salvation in Jesus Christ. Now, meanwhile, the high priest then sends guards to collect the apostles and bring them to stand before the Sanhedrin. But when the guards get to the jail room, they find no apostles there. And then they hear that the apostles are actually free and out in the temple precincts preaching the gospel. So finally, the high priest rounds up the apostles and brings them to stand before the Sanhedrin, and he says to them this: "We strictly charged you not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men." And this is an exception to the general rule. When the government demands that we do something that is explicitly commanded, that God commands us not to do, or asks us not to do something God tells us to do, we're given the right to disobey. It's called civil disobedience. And there's another example of civil disobedience in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's good friends, have been rounded up with all the other rulers and advisors of King Nebuchadnezzar, and they're told at the sound of the music they're to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. God had commanded the Jews not to bow to other images, and so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do it. The king brought them before him. He was furious that they refused to obey him, and he told them that if they did not bow down, he was going to give them a second chance. If they did not bow down, he would throw them into the furnace. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in a great show of faith, told the king that they would not do so, that their God could save them if he chose, but whether he did or not, they were not going to obey the king. And the king threw them into the fiery furnace, and God protected them and saved their lives. Now, there's two things that we can learn from these two examples. Number one, if the government tells us to do something that God has told us not to do, or if the government tells us not to do something that God has commanded us to do, we have the right to disobey our governmental rulers. However, two, we should know that if we disobey the government may punish us. Both Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the apostles knew that by disobeying the government, they might have to pay a consequence. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually were thrown into the furnace, although God saved them. So if we disobey, if we practice civil disobedience, we might need to expect that we will have to pay some consequences. But what if we resist the authorities even when they don't contradict God's commands? We see the answer in the next phrase. The next phrase reads, "And those who resist will incur judgment." Those who resist governmental authorities are resisting God's will and will incur either government punishment or punishment from God himself. Now, we have seen in verses 1 and 2 that we should voluntarily submit to governmental authorities because God has placed them in authorities over us, and resisting governmental authorities is the same as resisting God's will, and can result in punishment, either from the government or from God. But you may be asking yourself, why has God given civil authorities power over us? And we see the answer in the next two verses. In verses 3 and 4, we're going to see that we should obey the government as if they were God's very servant. Now, we don't usually think of our government as God's servant, and neither does our government tend to think of them as God's servant, but that's exactly what Paul says that they are. So let's take a look at verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Now let's take a look at that first phrase. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Now the Greek word for that is translated terror here is actually the Greek word phobos, which is the word that we get our word phobia from. If you have arachnophobia, you have a fear of spiders. So it really means a fear of something. Terror is probably a little too strong a term. The punishment that authorities can mete out is something that should cause fear in those who break the law. If you've ever been speeding down the highway, you know you're speeding, but you look up in your rearview mirror and you see a policeman behind you and you see his lights flashing, you know he wants you to pull over. You may be experiencing the fear of receiving a hefty fine for your speeding. And that's exactly what Paul is talking about here. If you do what is right, you have no reason to fear. If you're going down the highway at the posted speed and you see a policeman, you have nothing to fear from him because he's not going to stop you. He's going to approve of your behavior. Now, the next phrase is, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good and you will receive his approval. No one wants civil authorities interfering in their lives, but God has placed them over you to punish bad behavior and to approve good behavior. So if you don't want to experience the interference of authorities or the fear that authorities can produce, then do what is good. Obey the law. How much power do governments actually have over their people? We see the answer to this in verse 4. So let's take a look at verse 4. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Twice in this verse, Paul calls the government the servant of God. Now, I want you to remember that the government at when Paul wrote this letter was headed up by the Emperor Nero, who was considered one of the worst emperors who ever lived. In fact, many of his contemporaries thought of him as compulsive and corrupt. The historian Tacitus claimed that Nero blamed Christians for the fire that had burned much of Rome. Some people even believed that he had set the fire, and then had many of them burned alive because of his accusation that they had burned the city. But it was also Nero's government that allowed Paul to roam freely throughout the Roman Empire on roads that the Romans had built, and safe because of the Roman soldiers that provided him freedom from being robbed. And he shared the gospel freely because of the Roman Empire. God placed Nero on the throne, and he has placed our government in power as well. Now, you might not like your government, but if Paul could write these words about Nero, who was historically corrupt, then you should be thankful if your rulers are no more corrupt than he was. Paul writes, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. This mention of the sword means that God has given the government the power to take life, to put to death those who have resisted its power or broken its laws. Now, Christians are also told not to seek vengeance, but Paul tells us in verse 4, for he, that is the government, is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. If you have ever been had something stolen, or if you've ever been robbed or mugged, you want justice done. And that's why God has placed the government in place, so that some justice, although it's not perfect, can be done. You want the government to catch the person who has done wrong and to be punished. You want to be reimbursed. Now, we might not always like what our government does, but if we are free to worship God and to share our faith in safe neighborhoods, then we should thank God for his servant, the government, and for the freedom that they provide us. Now, we have seen that the government is God's appointed servant to punish evildoers and to approve of righteous behavior. But do we have any other obligations to the government apart from obedience to its laws? Yes, we do, as we will see in verses 5 through 7. In verses 5 through 7, we will see that Christians should obey the government as the laws as being the revealed will of God. What should be our motivation in obeying the government, and how far should we go in our obedience? Let's take a look at verses 5 through 7 to see the answer. Let's see verse 5 first. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Now, this verse encapsulates the motivation for obedience to the government. We do not want to experience God's punishment for violating the laws of his instituted servant, the government. So we should obey the laws of the land. But there is a much stronger reason for us to obey the government, and that is because of our conscience. We want our conscience to be clear. God has revealed his will to us through his appointed servant, the government. So if we break the laws of the government, the Holy Spirit will convict us of our need to obey, and he will convict us of our wrongdoing. So we should actually obey the law for three different reasons. First, so that our conscience will be clear, and second, so that we have a good testimony with our neighbors, so that we can share the gospel with them. Who's going to want to listen to the gospel from someone who is a lawbreaker? And three, we cannot follow in Jesus' footsteps if we are unwilling, if we're willing to break the law. If anyone has reason to break the laws of the land, it would be the sovereign Son of God. But he obeyed the laws of Rome as well as the laws of Moses, and we should follow his example. There are good reasons to obey our government, but how far should we go in our obedience to the government? Let's take a look at verses 6 and 7 for the answer. Verse 6 first. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. As God's servant, the government has the right to levy taxes so that they can make and keep the laws that keep us safe from lawlessness. We must not use the excuse that the government uses the money for impure and immoral things, so we're not going to pay our taxes. The truth is that Rome didn't use all of their tax money for purely moral reasons. And Paul still encouraged the Romans to pay their taxes. So we should not resist paying taxes simply because the government does some things that we think are wrong. Paying taxes allows the government to carry out God's will in our lives. Now let's take a look at verse 7. Verse 7 says, pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. This verse tells us that we should give the government whatever is owed them in basically two areas, monetary and then in respect. We should pay all of our taxes, all of the revenue that is owed them, and we should give them honor and respect because they are God's servant. So how can we apply these verses? Number one, if you live safely in a neighborhood and you have the freedom to worship as you choose, thank God for the government that provides that safety. 2, pray that the government will actually serve God, not just because God has given them authority, but because they choose to. And 3, pay your taxes with a grateful heart. Chuck Swindoll once wrote, "A good Christian is a good citizen. You keep the law of the land. You don't run red lights. You don't purposely overpark, and you don't evade your tax income. You maintain the speed limit." Someone once said, rightly so, I think, the last thing to get saved on a Christian is their right foot.